So we've been getting quite a lot of information and gameplay shown to us for Borderlands 4, and in my opinion, most of what we've been shown has just made me more excited for the game. But one thing that we very specifically have not been shown any of is the endgame. And while the developers have also not wanted to talk about the endgame, we've still gotten some hints and teases at what we can expect in the endgame. And even though they haven't outright shown us endgame gameplay, we know of a handful of endgame systems. Now, one of the very specific endgame systems are called Specializations, and this is essentially the replacement for badass ranks or other equivalent systems from previous Borderlands games, where after you hit max level, you have this infinite or almost infinite progression system. In a lot of previous Borderlands games, it was essentially just stat increases. Like Borderlands 3, you could just keep putting a very small amount of stats into pretty much any stat you wanted, kind of similar to the Paragon system from something like Diablo 3. And in Borderlands 4, we're gonna have this specialization system that is a somewhat equivalent to those systems, but there's one big difference in that it seems like it's not going to be stat increases. Specifically, the developers have said this is going to be less about just increasing your stats and more about selecting different perks or different effects that have a bigger impact on your gameplay and are more interesting choices, and choices actually being pretty interesting because in a lot of the previous Borderlands games, you didn't actually make many choices because you could still get pretty much any of the stats you wanted. It was just when you put that in, but it sounds like this specialization system, and also going off of its name, is going to be maybe a handful of different perks or effects that you choose one or the other, or maybe you choose between a handful of them, but once you choose that one, you can't have, say, multiple in maybe the same row active at a time. Now, there will probably be respecking of this system as well, but you will still have to be making choices at that point, and you won't be able to get everything. And again, it sounds like this isn't going to just be increasing your stats. It's more going to be giving you interesting effects or perks, and I very much hope these are actually substantial gameplay changes or new effects, because that is significantly more interesting than you just getting another level or another badass rank and getting like 0.1% crit or something. And that's one of the systems that's very obviously endgame, because you have to hit max level before you can even start to get specialization points. But this next system is going to be able to be used before the endgame, but the developers have talked about it like it's more focused on endgame, and this is the new firmware system, and we actually still don't know a ton about the system, and more specifically, we don't know the actual effects. So in Borderlands 4, all 5 of your non-weapon gear pieces will be able to roll firmware on them, and these are essentially gear sets. So let's say you get a firmware piece on your class mod that will show an icon and some name to whatever that firmware piece is, and then it will have some number out of 3. If it's not equipped, it'll be 0 out of 3. If you have 1 equipped, 1 out of 3. If you have 3 pieces with the same firmware on it equipped, it'll be 3 out of 3. And these are essentially gear sets that give you new effects or stats or bonuses just by having at least one of that firmware piece equipped, and presumably the more you have on, the stronger it gets. We don't actually know if that's the case. It could be you just get new effects for having more pieces of the same set on, but presumably it's going to be 1 piece gives you the smallest bonus of that set, 3 piece gives you a more buffed up bonus. But what's really interesting is since you have these 5 gear pieces, you can have 5 different pieces of firmware on at once. So you could have 5 separate firmware pieces on, all rank 1 out of 3, or you could have a 3 out of 3 firmware set and a 2 out of 3 somewhere else, or you could have a 3 out of 3 set and 2 additional 1 out of 3 sets. So this is essentially just additional progression and gearing on top of everything else, because keep in mind, if you're wanting to say get a legendary class mod with a couple specific stat rolls, you would then also want to be getting firmware, but we do also already have it confirmed based upon some gameplay we've been shown that there is going to be a way to take the firmware off of one piece and put it on another piece. And this seems to be the only kind of item crafting we have in the game. And I think the main reason they're doing this is they know there's already going to be a good amount of RNG in the game. Previous Borderlands games, there was a lot of RNG. Borderlands 4, there may be even more than previous games, and they probably don't want you getting some super rare class mod that has all the best stats on it, that's a legendary one you want, all the best rolls possible, and then you don't have firmware, and firmware ends up being really good because it's a new system and they want it to be really strong, and you just don't have it on that piece, so you kind of throw that piece away. So you'll be able to remove firmware from one piece and put it on another. Now these are the main pieces of endgame that we've had detailed to us so far, but there's a ton of additional information on how they're going about developing the endgame. One of the most interesting ones is how they've been talking about our skill trees. So skill trees of Borderlands 4 are significantly bigger than any previous game. I think they're like 3 times bigger overall than even Borderlands 3, and we know we're not going to have as many points as a lot of people would want. It seems max level is 50, so we'll have 49 points to spend, and we don't know if there's going to be more points obtained through, say, other side objectives throughout the game or something like that. This was actually a specific design choice because we have gotten it confirmed when they've talked a little bit about this that there will be level cap increases with additional content somewhere down the road. So they were kind of building these systems with the end game in mind. One of the ways they're doing that is not giving us a ridiculous amount of starting points when the game first launches, because they know they're going to be giving us more points later down the road as they increase the level cap. Now, there have been a handful of interviews that some of the developers have talked about endgame a little bit. Now, Game Informer did do an interview with some of the developers, one of the main ones being Graham Timmons, who is the creative director on Borderlands 4 and seems to be kind of focused on the endgame. But they start off saying, clearly the studio wants to keep most of the details under wraps when specifically talking about the endgame. And when I asked Timmons about the kind of endgame that exists in Borderlands 4, he initially starts with, well, we will have an endgame, which every Borderlands game hasn't had on launch. I can say that. However, after Gearbox Global creative executive and former Game Informer editor-in-chief Andrew Reiner chimes in by saying it's very ambitious, Timmons opens up a bit more. So this is something that's very much been said by multiple developers, is that the endgame is ambitious and a lot of the game has been developed specifically around the endgame. So they go on and say, I care about it a lot personally, as my role on Borderlands 3 was curating what became the endgame for that. Timmons says, I know what's important to our community, and that's built already into the game. A very important part of this, because he's specifically saying, I worked on what became the endgame of Borderlands 3, because Borderlands 3 really didn't have an endgame on launch. So the fact that they're building Borderlands 4 with the endgame in mind, and specifically with what he thinks the community wants for the endgame, is very interesting. Like, we made purposeful decisions with our action skill tree, assuming what will come in the future with our endgame. It's not a secret that we always eventually do level cap increases. That's built into the high level design of saying, okay, if that's still going to be in our future, how can we make our action skill tree this time anticipate that and be balanced from the jump? So in Borderlands 3, they increased the level cap and it felt like you could kind of get everything. That's never a good place for a skill tree. Really good skill trees should always feel like you can't get everything you want and you have to make some hard choices. So they go on to say the team drew lessons from past games, including the most recent entry in the series, in designing the endgame for Borderlands 4. In Borderlands 3, we ended at 72 skill points, Timmons says. It's a really high number, right? And so for the game designer and me, that can create a lot of chaos with how those action skills were designed. You lose build diversity as you add more skill points, because everyone's homogenous, because they all have the same skills ultimately unlocked. We've thought about Borderlands 4's endgame from the jump, and we have some great plans for it that we're going to share, but I think we're taking a lot of lessons from both Tiny Tina's Wonderlands and Borderlands 4 to make sure that we can execute the best version of the endgame yet for Borderlands. And I really like that they're also taking learnings from Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, because I think the leveling up process and the main story and campaign of that game was actually very good. And I think the endgame was good when you first did it, and then as you got into repeat runs, it got very boring very quickly, because they were supposed to have this kind of randomized endgame system that didn't feel super randomized or rewarding. So I really like that they're taking learnings from both games. So the really big through line through a lot of these different developer interviews and what a lot of the developers have been saying is that they have been designing the endgame of Borderlands 4 since the start of the game. They have designed a lot of the systems specifically around the end game, the progression. All of these different things have been designed with their end game in mind. Now, another piece that they've actually hinted at or basically told us is that invincible bosses or raid bosses will be coming to the game at some point. It wasn't clear if they were saying invincible or raid bosses will be in the game on launch or they will be coming sometime after launch. And I would be very surprised if within the first year we don't have a handful of raid bosses at least. And I would honestly be surprised if Borderlands 4 doesn't launch with at least one invincible boss. I would be incredibly surprised if that were the case. In fact, I personally theorize that there's actually going to be at least a handful of raid bosses on launch that specifically require you to get to the end game and be very strong with a very good build to defeat. Now, another tease that may be tied more specifically into the end game is the multiple teases Randy Pitchford has given us about Pearlescent being in the game. We all know about his joke on the PAX East panel where he was naming off all the rarities and then also partially named off Pearlescent and then said that was just a joke. But he also in another interview kind of teased Pearlescent being in the game, basically saying that there's going to be these like ultra rare items that basically nobody finds and someone's just going to find one and it's going to be absolutely crazy in the community. So I think there is the possibility that there are Pearlescents in the game on launch, but based upon how Randy Pitchford has tried to tease this, if that's the case, I think they may only be endgame specific, like you need to be max level and you need to maybe do some max level version of some very difficult bosses to even have a chance to get it, and it's going to be some super low chance. I think there's a possibility of that, and if my theory is correct that there will be raid bosses on launch, I think it could be that you have to be max level and only raid bosses have a chance to even drop them, and they're going to be incredibly rare and maybe much more interesting than previous games' Pearlescent weapons. But that's pretty much all of the information I could find so far on the end game of Borderlands 4. We do know that they are going to be showing off a lot more of the end game before launch, and we're only like 50 days away from launch, so probably within the next month I would expect we will be getting a panel or a showcase of a lot of the end game systems we can expect in Borderlands 4, and that's the thing I'm most excited for. Me personally, I'm most excited for build crafting, which already looks absolutely crazy, and then what specific endgame content we're going to be getting. And I'm probably more excited for Borderlands 4 than I've been for any previous Borderlands game. We already know the build crafting is going to be the craziest of the franchise. Everything that I've been saying about the endgame tells me that it's going to be the biggest endgame of any Borderlands game. They've specifically said that as well, but both of those things are the things I find the most important. So if both of those are even decent, Borderlands 4 is going to be pretty good. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.